to very different incentives for the people who are building these libraries, and it provides a resource to almost everybody of a kind that was unimaginable not that long ago. Let me just extend out without a slide to think about public libraries in this context. Right? Suppose that, and indeed it would have been true under the Google settlement, which didn't go through. Suppose that public libraries also had access to these resources. Approximately 16 million works held by academic libraries, available to anybody who walks in the door of any district library in Michigan. What does that world look like? On the one hand, it's terrifying, right? Oh God, there's all this stuff, and they can get all that stuff, and our millage didn't buy the stuff. On the other hand, it's exhilarating. If people are going to walk into our library and make sense of this stuff and be able to navigate it well and use it well, they're going to need some intelligent help and some guidance. And so instead of worrying so much about small things, there's really room for librarians everywhere to be teaching in this context of a trusted community space how to make sense of this revolution that I've been talking about. That's kind of interesting. And oh, by the way, it saves some money, right? You actually, I mean, the interlibrary loan charges go way down in this environment. There's all kinds of stuff that you can get at immediately. If the Google settlement, and I should probably talk about the Google lawsuit if I'm going to talk about the settlement, if it had gone through in its original form, we would now be living approximately in this world. And indeed, part of that settlement would have been a free kiosk in every public library in America that anybody could go to and have access to this resource. Not enough. One kiosk is small in a large library district, and there would have been a charge for licenses for other ones, although I think those charges would have come to be reasonable. That's a debatable point that we can get to when we start debating. But the publishers and authors sued Google for the digitization project that Google had been engaged in at Michigan and elsewhere. And the settlement that was reached was one in which the collections would indeed have been shareable across the US anyhow, at some cost for many users, but not for all users. The judge didn't allow that settlement for a whole variety of reasons, and I'm going to use the excuse that among the many things that I'm not as a lawyer, for not talking further about that yet, but if you have questions about it, I'll certainly take them. Here's another piece that we don't think about. This is based on a study that I did with a graduate student of mine. And these numbers are certainly wrong. But it doesn't matter, because they could be off by a factor of 4, and the point would still be there. So keeping books in an OpenStack environment where the climate control is good for books, the annual cost of storing a book is somewhere around $4. It's mostly space, right? Space and heat and air conditioning, and then the cost of circulating. But mostly space and heat and air conditioning are the cost there. That's big money, big money. If you're the University of Michigan Library and you have 8 million books, do the math. And it's a big number. If you want to keep the book in an efficient high-density storage space, it's much cheaper. It gets down below $1 a book a year. But the cost of keeping that same book in digital form, duplicated 2 times, in different media, in different tectonic plates, so keeping it very securely, is on the order of 15 cents a book a year. So you can imagine a world. How often does a college professor and university administrator actually point to ways to save money in higher education? Right? You've never heard of one before. This is a first. You can imagine a world in which most of the use copies of works in academic libraries are digital, and instead of hundreds of libraries, in some cases thousands of libraries, each having 1 or 2 print copies of things that don't get read very much anymore, you could pool those resources and keep securely. Tell me how many you need. 5, 10, 2 dozen? much, much cheaper than 1,000. Remember, every time we get rid of one, or we figure out how to share one, once we fully load the costs of storing the book and having the space, we save about $4 a year. So every time you can swap a 15-center there for the $4 a year, but wait, the 15-cent thing you only have to do 3 or 4 times, because then it's available all around the country, and indeed if the rights environment is right, all around the world. So there's a lot of money to be saved getting libraries to share legacy print collections if they can use the digital surrogate instead. Now, they can't in general for works that are in copyright. So this currently works for about somewhere in the order of a quarter of the collections of academic libraries, the works that have risen above copyright due to their advanced age. So this is a reference. People who get the film reference should now snicker for a moment. People who don't can see me after class. If the Google settlement had gone through or something like it, this becomes not far-fetched. The library's in your pocket. It's not quite true. What actually is in your pocket now, if you want it to be, is the library catalog. So Michigan's catalog and Harvard's catalog and Stanford's catalog are all perfectly available on your smartphone. The next step, which we haven't quite gotten to yet, but we have actually for millions of works that are in the public domain, is that you can actually have the work on your smartphone. I'm getting a little old to read it on a smartphone, so I have to carry around a big, heavy tablet that weighs almost 1.5 pounds to read them. But that actually works very well, and we're going to be there. The technology's there. The legal environment isn't entirely there, but it's you want a revolution? That's really different than carrying the Library of Congress around on your back. Here's a deep problem for universities, and not only for universities. Most of the works of the 20th century are not legally available in digital form, even if our library and others had digitized them. They're in copyright. There's a copyright holder. We have no right to display those works except under very unusual circumstances, largely for people who have print disabilities. And yet our students, our children, and to confess, lots of our colleagues, if they can't find it digitally, they just go on to the next thing that's close enough. And this is a problem that is a very serious one for those of us who run academic and cultural heritage institutions. We want people to be able to find the good stuff. We live in an environment where much of the good stuff is much harder to find than stuff that isn't as good, right? Because the open web has all kinds of stuff, much of it excellent, but figuring out which is excellent and which is not, you'd like to have access to the authentic library materials, and often you don't. I should get through this quickly, so I'm going to just skip over most of copyright. Everything I have to say is actually summarized on this slide. So what the slide says is, class, today's lesson on sharing has been canceled. It will be replaced by a lesson called Protecting Intellectual Property. And so when I showed this slide once when I was giving a talk, and one of the people in the audience actually lives in the Hollywood area and says that, oh yes, in the public schools in Beverly Hills, where her daughter goes to school, that's exactly what happens, right? So there's I forget whether it was 3rd or 5th grade, but in fact, there's a module that the kids are taught. You know, you might be in sort of, in the back of a movie set sometime when someone takes a picture. You got to worry about your intellectual property, right? That's an important part of life. And indeed, I've showed this slide again in a different setting, and a friend of mine who's a member of the Copyright Bar said, oh yeah, the Copyright Association, the Copyright Society has a curriculum that they send to their members that they suggest that when your kid has Parents' Day in 3rd or 5th grade or wherever, you should come and teach this curriculum about copyright law, intellectual property, and how to protect it. So this is good news, that this cartoon isn't completely made up. The problem with copyright is not that it's a bad idea, it's actually a good idea. It's a good idea to have incentives for authors to produce works of authorship that they can then convert into an income. If not, some works of authorship won't happen. The problem with copyright is that the way it exists now in the US, the copyright term is absurdly long. It's life plus 70 years, right? So remember my joke about 2079? Nope, anything written today is actually still going to be in copyright then. And a great deal of work is of uncertain copyright status, and it's uncertain who holds the copyright. So it's very hard to know what can and cannot be lawfully or safely used. And so the interchange of ideas, which actually is a clear purpose of copyright law. Indeed, the Constitution says in order to promote progress in science and the useful arts, there will be this temporary period in which authors and inventors have rights to their works. But what we're interested in as a social matter is the advancement of science and the useful arts. Copyright terms have gotten too long, and the difficulty of finding whether things are in copyright and who holds them has gotten too difficult for those things to be served well. And this is just shows the changes. I'm almost going to stop because I want to have some time to talk. I do want to go, I briefly talked about the Google settlement. If it had happened, the big academic libraries would have had access to the collections of many other big academic libraries that would have been enormously productive. We would have had much better ability for people with print disabilities to read quickly, to have access to the current literature. We would have had these public library kiosks that I talked about. Everybody would have been able to freely browse in a bookstore of something between 16 and 20 million works to see if they were interested in that, and to read actually a fair chunk of it, 20% or more, without having to pay anything. And then from the library perspective, it would have had this advantage of being able to rationalize our collections, because there would have been reading copies of so many things. We could do a much more efficient job of preservation by sharing across libraries. Settlement didn't go through, but the academic libraries of the US and other parts, some internationally, have built a digital collection now that has over 10 million volumes in it. And what's interesting about this collection is, so it helps us with the preservation problem. It doesn't help us much with the access problem, because the works that are in copyright, we can't display. We'd love to be able to make arrangements with the rights holders to do that. Before that happens, a number of lawsuits are going to have to end one way or another. And then even then, finding actually who holds the rights is a rather difficult problem. But we do have this enormous collection that can be searched. So if you go to hatitrust.org and look at the search box and search for titles or search for phrases, you can search this entire corpus of text, and if you find something you're looking for, it'll tell you what library it came from if it's in copyright, and you can go to that library, or you can go to Google Book Search, and Google Book will tell you where the nearest library is, and at least it's a way of being able to get through the information that's in our collections that we never had before. Right? What we used to have is the catalog. The catalog was a wonderful instrument of scholarship, a marvelous finding tool, but now we can actually search the full texts, and that gives us a very different kind of lens on the collections out there. Let's get past that. The future. Yeah. So, I'm just going to jump to, what do we want to do? We have a world that was organized around, the idea that the money that comes from producing and distributing books, ideas in book form, the kinds of things that show up in libraries, comes from selling a physical object that is durable. Oops, that's not the world we live in anymore. And so the question is, how do we construct institutions